Mission San Juan Capistrano was permanently founded by Junípero Serra on November 1, 1776, as the 7th of 21 missions to be established in California by the Spanish. Known as the Jewel of the Missions, Mission San Juan Capistrano is a historic landmark and museum with permanent exhibits featuring original artifacts as well as traveling and temporary exhibits on a wide variety of topics. The miracle of the Swallows of Capistrano takes place each year at Mission San Juan Capistrano, on March 19, St. Joseph's Day. Swallows migrate 6,000 miles from Goya, Argentina to San Juan Capistrano in large groups.
If you think about it, Mission San Juan Capistrano, which was established in 1776, just a few months after the new American government told King George of England to go pound sand, just a few months later, now St. Junípero Serra came up what was to become the El Camino Real and established this, the 7th of the 21 missions. 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. It was just 50 years later, in 1542, that Juan Carlos Rodriguez landed in San Diego Harbor and claimed Alta California as Spanish property. This is the Spanish territory. It went almost 250 years, though, because they had so much going on in South America, in Central America, and of course in Mexico. Their hands were full, so really this was the last thing on the king's mind. But when the French, the British, and especially the Russians started to come into California, the Russians they owned Alaska at the time, and their soldiers were freezing to death, they were starving, and they needed food. So they came down to California. They established Fort Ross in Upper Alta California. And that's when King Carlos of Spain said, we need to establish guns, gold, and God in Alta California, in that order. The guns were the soldiers that were going to protect the Spanish claim. The gold was not the California gold rush. It was going to be the taxpayers that were going to be established. The padres and the soldiers were sent to teach all these new professions to these new people of California that are being introduced to the European culture. So that is the gold. Nobody knew about the California gold rush at that time. And then the last component, of course, is God, and that was the Catholicism, the Christianity that was introduced into California. The Padres introduced European culture to the Acjachemen peoples here in South Orange County, and they get started on the mission. They build what we call the quad. This quad, without the overhang here, was finished in the early 1780s. And this was one of those jobs, these adobe bricks that were made 240 some odd years ago. They got the quad up, and then about 10 years later, in the 1790s, they put the overhang on. And this is a very critical part of any mission. That is the protection for this adobe. Non-fired, this is rock here, but this is non-fired adobe brick, which will melt if it gets wet. And this portion of it was the kitchen that was used to cook for the Padres' meals. Now, because the Padres' meals were cooked in here, only men could come in at that time. Back then, when they'd have mass or the religious ceremonies, it would be a mass for women, and then they'd have a mass for men. Everything was separated back then. And with the Padres, only men could be around them at the time. So this was done for the Padres' meals. And if you look up here, you can see this black soot going up the chimney. This is the only chimney out of the 21 missions that was built like this. So Mission San Juan Capistrano is very unique in the way this chimney was established. But all that black soot is from those meals 243 whatever years ago. And this is the front door to the mission. Basically, anybody that wanted to come into the mission from the outside, this was the soldiers' barracks over here, and this was the outside of the mission. So anybody that would come banging on this door asking to be let in were always greeted with what was established to be known as the Franciscan way, which is you're always welcome. And this mission was attacked by pirates in the early 1800s. This and Santa Barbara. This is the room that the Padres did all of their homework. Their record keeping at the California missions was impeccable. And we have the good fortune to say that we have all of those records still in the archive. So especially genealogists that are looking for family history or anything like that are able to come to the mission and get those records. And once establishing the tie to the mission, it also opens up special privileges for funerals and things like that. This mission has been under 3 national flags. We had the Spanish flag from 1776 here, 1769 in Alta California, to 1820, and then the Mexican till 1846, and then the United States since then. And this was where they did all their paperwork. When they got to the Mexican period, basically the Mexican government said, we've had enough time training. You're going to have 5 more years. After that 5 years, the support is gone, and the missions were eventually sold. Pio Pico, the last Mexican governor, sold the missions, and this was the last one he sold. He saved this one for his brand new brother-in-law, and who just married his little sister. Juan Forster moved in from Great Britain and, of course, changed his name to Don Juan Forster. And Don Juan Forster and his wife Isadora lived here for 20 years. About 10 years into that, the U.S. Patent Office said, you know, that's really not your property, and they still fought it in court. And it wasn't until about 3 weeks before he was assassinated that President Abraham Lincoln signed the proclamation reverting all of the California missions back to the Catholic Church. The missions themselves, not the tens of thousands of acres that went with the missions. So the Foresters still held on to the property here, but at least the mission was back to the Catholic Church. And that's when this gentleman, Father José Mut, moved in. And for 20 years, Father Mut was here trying to protect what was left of the mission. And it was in the late 1880s that a group of philanthropists from Los Angeles put their funds together. It was headed up by the head of the Los Angeles County Library System. And they, realizing the critical importance of the California missions to California's history. Now, this was the Padres' bedroom. Father Serra was here at the mission, and every night Father Serra would sleep on that for a bed. That's his bed. And I always tell the kids that, you know, if that wasn't uncomfortable enough, they could always cuddle up with one of these nice wool blankets. But, you know, some of their garments, the nice, you know, walking around in 110-degree heat, wearing one of these things. People would come to that front gate and knock on it. mention the Franciscan Way. Well, the Franciscan Way was anybody that came to that gate and knocked would be welcome. Their cattle and their horses would be taken off, fed and watered, and they would be brought in, and they would be able to sit down and enjoy as much food as they would like. They could eat as much as they'd like. When they got here, they could stay as long as they'd like. If they wanted to stay a day, that was great. If they needed to stay a week, they're welcome. If they're here for a month, they're part of the family. And when it was time to go, they would prepare a lunch to make sure they got to the next missions. Why do you think they would be so anxious to have people come in, and the padres and the senior military leadership would be with them during this meal? Why do you think they were so interested? It was so they could find out what is going on out in the world. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have newspapers or radios or TV or anything like that. And so anytime they had an opportunity to say, what the heck is going on? There's a new country called the United States of America, and they went up against King George of England. So when we walk through here, I always tell the kids, look down, look down. You can see how the tile was back in the day, and over here you can see how it is, so we don't have people tripping all over the place. But more importantly, if you look up, you can see how the mission was built. First, they had to build these 4-foot thick adobe walls, brick by brick. They'd make those adobes, and they'd build it up to the height that they wanted to go, and then they would have to go and get timbers, these logs, to lay across to build the ceiling. And the missions were always a result of their local confines. And this mission is very narrow compared to other missions. And that's because they had to go about 20 miles away to find the trees to make these ceilings. So they went up to what is still called Trabuco Canyon, up past Lake Forest and past Irvine. And the reason it's called Trabuco Canyon was because on one of their journeys up there, the Trabuco was a special rifle that the soldiers used. It was especially good for the Spanish equestrian soldiers because it was shorter and you were able to still hold your reins and get a shot off. Well, they lost a Trabuco up in that canyon. And so every time they went up to get more trees, they'd send out a search party looking for that Trabuco. And it's still called Trabuco Canyon. So these are the original logs. But what you're also, I would like to point out, is all of this earthquake retrofitting, all of this steel that has been put throughout the mission at the mission's expense. There's no outside group that's helping with that. When the mission was established in 1776, this was the quad, and this was the first part that was built following these other areas. The water would be brought in from an upper creek, and then it was put into these 3 distributaries that went through these zanjas that went across the industrial field here. That's where all the work took place. Here's the chimney for the kitchen that we went through for the Padres meals. During the Forster 20 years of living here, they took care of from here to there to there. Everything else melted away, and it was just absolute tragedy. So a lot of this has been rebuilt. In 1797, they started construction of the Great Stone Church. It took them 9 years, stone by stone, to build this Great Stone Church. And then on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, on December 8th, 1812, after only standing for 6 years, the bell tower fell on top of the south end of the church, crushing the roof onto the women that were below. It was a women's mass. And here on the feast of the day that Mary finds out that she is carrying the child of God, 39 women were killed and the 2 young men, so 41 people on that day in December. And already that year, they had lost almost 200 people from all of the diseases that were being brought over. So you had 250 basically people that have already expired in 1 year, and they still had close to 2,000 people here at the mission. How many soldiers do you think it would take to keep that many people under control? It was between 5 and 6 soldiers at each of the missions. In all of the Spanish years, from 1769 to 1820, the Spanish had between 225 and 250 soldiers, up against 200,000 to 300,000 native peoples. In 1910, the gentleman that really turned this mission into the jewel of the missions was a young Catholic priest who was from Indiana. And he was told that he had about 2 years to live. He had a severe respiratory illness. So on July 5th, 1910, Father St. O'Sullivan, it looks like St. John O'Sullivan, it's a Gaelic name, an Irish name, that St. O'Sullivan got off the train a couple of blocks down the street, walking up Camino Capistrano to this mission. He absolutely fell in love with this mission. And here this young man who had 2 years left to live spent the next 23 years turning this into the jewel of the missions. First of all, the oldest continuously used building in the state of California. But more importantly, it's the only building standing, only chapel, only mission, only building standing that now St. Junípero Serra actually officiated the sacraments in. In 1784, just before he died, he came through Mission San Juan Capistrano again, and although he was not a bishop, he was the Padre Presidente. All of these timbers are all the original timbers that were put in those early days to have this open in 1782. This is a working chapel. They have daily mass here. If you're available at 6:30 in the morning, any weekday, it's a wonderful mass. The organist, John, is playing the organ. Nice way to start the day off each day. So Father St. O'Sullivan gets here in 1910, just 15 years or so after the roof had been replaced, to bring it back to a chapel status. And Father O'Sullivan is here, and he hears that there is a then 300-year-old altar from Barcelona, Spain, in storage up in Los Angeles. So he went up and talked to the bishop, and of course, his wonderful Irish determination told the bishop, this is a Spanish mission. That's a Spanish altar. It belongs there. And the bishop said, well, I've already promised it to the San Bernardino diocese. Father O'Sullivan said, oh, but Your Eminence. Well, he got it. And when he got it, they delivered 10 huge crates, wooden crates, with 196 different pieces of this puzzle in those crates. And it took them over a year and a half of trying to figure out what it looked like, how big it was, how wide it was, how tall it was. Getting nowhere, it wasn't until somebody who had been to Europe with a camera in the 20s, or whenever it was, very rare, they had taken pictures of other altars, and from those pictures, they were able to finally put this together. So out here in this cemetery, there are over 3,000 bodies. And basically up until the 1850s, they would bury anybody. They would come out and they would dig down until they found the remains of the last person, lay that person, wrap them in cloth and lay that person on top of the other. And that stopped in about the 1850s, and there's another cemetery over on the other side of now the freeway. But the only persons that have been buried out here since that time was Father St. O'Sullivan. There is another headstone over here. This was from one of the soldiers, one of the first soldiers that took care of Mission San Juan Capistrano, who was awarded a land grant and received thousands of acres from the king for his good service as a soldier to the king. So this great stone church took 9 years to build. Rock by rock, they'd go about 5 miles down the Ortega Highway. The Ortega Highway was named after Jose Francisco Ortega, who was the first lead. He was the advance man or the scout for the Portolá expedition. Ortega, they say Portolá walked up and down California. Ortega did it 4 times. He'd go up, find the route, come back, find his guys, go up, find the route. So he's going back and forth, back and forth. They were looking for Monterey. They walked right by it, discovered the San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate. So this is called the Sacred Garden. And basically anybody that got out of the Great Stone Church alive that day of the earthquake came out through this door, through the sacristy. And if you'd like, we can go into the sacristy. This is where the padres would prepare for Mass, dress in the vestments and say their pre-Mass prayers and everything. When the earthquake took place and the south end of the church was collapsed, the padre called to everybody, "Ven aquí, come close, come up this way." The 2 other doors were jammed shut. They were unable to open because of the weight on the building. But basically, he had everybody come up, and anybody that got out of this church alive got out through this door into what is now called the Sacred Garden. And these bells were critically important to the daily activity of the mission. Everything they did was done by a certain bell ring. Bells were their communication during the day. And these bells, the 2 smaller bells up here, are the actual bells that crashed during the earthquake in 1812. The 2 larger ones, like the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, when they crashed down onto the church, they both cracked. So they became unusable in the sense of a good bell. But what they did was they patched the cracks, and they were able to recast. They were able to take molds of the original bells and recast them. And so what we have are exact duplicates of the actual bells. Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks were both married here. 1 or 2 of some of the shots of Zorro were filmed here. This was adobe. This has a protective cover on it, so it doesn't destroy the adobe. In the 1990s, there was a major retrofit. I don't know the figures, but basically in areas you can see these were reconfigured, recarved. So this has all been redone. So as they built this, they needed to build scaffolds to continue building up. So they'd leave these holes. Looks like somebody's left a lucky quarter in there. And they'd put the posts out that they'd be able to build their scaffolding up. These are what are called trip pens, and these are the Secret Service trip pens. The first one with Pope John Paul when he was beatified. Well, I worked for 3 presidents. Bush, and Reagan as a White House advance man, a lead advance man. So basically, when the president goes out, the advance team goes out. If it's a domestic trip, it's 5 to 7 days before he or she gets in town. They come in, and the advance team, we take our orders from the executive office of the president. We're there we want to accomplish this, that, and the other. Okay, the Secret Service is there. They are there to make sure to maintain the security for the president. The White House Communications Agency is there. That is the esprit de corps from every branch of the military. They pool their resources. So the best of the best are the guys and gals that anywhere the president goes, he has the communications ability. He is recorded, his speech is recorded. The bricks, could be for the floor bricks that would have been fired, or the adobe bricks that each weigh about 60 pounds when they're done. But basically, they had mixed the 5 ingredients used to make the adobe: the sand, the dirt, the grass or hay, water, and the secret ingredient, cow poop. This is where the meals were cooked for the rest of the population. The same meal, it would be azzoli in the morning, which is roasted barley, kind of like a oatmeal breakfast porridge, and then puzzoli, which is more like a beef or pork stew with vegetables. That'd be the midday meal, and then azzoli again in the evening. Before Father O'Sullivan got here and started doing the excavation of all this was all a big pile of mud. This was just completely covered over. That anything like this, any of the metal hinges or the wheel caps or any of the metal tools or anything like that would have had to have come from either Mexico or the East Coast, not from California. These 2 Catalan furnaces, called the Catalan furnace, and this will take temperature up to 3,200 degrees. So they were able to get ships, could load their hulls, empty ships would load their hulls with either rocks, or if they could, iron ore for nothing, wherever that came from. They'd be able to load that in as ballast, come out to California, offload that, trade it for the skins, the tallow, or whatever it is that the food that they're getting from the missions. So this is what I really try to impress upon the kids as a critical point of the mission, because of the diseases and everything that were brought over from Europe. Just the constant diseases that we experience in day-to-day life. And I always ask them, what's the first thing your parents say when you get home after playing out all day? Go wash your hands. Yeah, well, that's because you got to break that chain of infection. And this is where they did that. From the fat, they'd get about 100 pounds of fat off of each cow. They'd take that fat, put them in these big cauldrons, cook it until all the impurities would float to the top, skim it off, then they would have their tallow. From that tallow, they could make candles, which were critically important at that time. They didn't have the electricity that might have whale oil, but that's slim pickings otherwise. There in 1939, all of a sudden, the Swallows is being sung all around the world. And so here, Father O'Sullivan had just died recently, and all of a sudden people all around the world are talking about the Swallows returning from Argentina each year. And on St. Joseph's Day, sure enough, here they are. So Leon René made this song, became a huge hit.